turning our attention to something that concerns us and the business that we do here each morning. Believe it or not, I'm sure that you're privy to the fact that the business of news and journalism is changing around the world. There have been threats, as many businesses have been facing, and of course, these threats also present opportunities. For the very first time, journalists are meeting or they've met in Nigeria, West African journalists, the first ever West African Journalism Innovation Conference held right here in Abuja, and this was put together by the Center for Innovation Development. Center for Innovation.
Center for Journalism.
Innovation. How did I leave out journalism?
I know, right?
How did I leave out the core of that? Journalism, Innovation and Development, CJID. They were also very, very honored to have with them at that conference Mr. Richard Jingra, who is the Vice President of Google News. You're welcome to our program this morning, and we're very honored to have you.
I'm delighted to be here.
How, this is not your first time in Nigeria, is it?
It is actually my first time.
It is?
Yes.
Well, you land in Abuja first.
Yes.
And I'm sure you've heard about Lagos. Would you like to visit?
I would love to visit Lagos.
This
That's
Lagos.
a set-up question.
Because my colleague here actually lives in Lagos, and he just came here for the...
I'm simply waiting the invitation.
So Kayode, over to you. But indeed, oftentimes when people think about Google, what comes to your mind is the search engine. And I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that that's the core of your business. I would not really immediately go to news. So what precisely do you do at Google News? Do you curate? Are you a platform? Or are you also into content?
Well, when I say Vice President of News at Google, it's how we present news to our users on Google Search, on Google News, any of the experiences we have, but it includes Google Search. And people come to Google Search all the time in quest to find out the latest on a specific news story. So we don't curate. It is entirely done computationally, algorithmically, to make sure that we're doing our best to surface authoritative sources that are relevant to the question that the user might have.
Very interesting. And, you jumped right to an issue to some of the things I've noted down here, talking about algorithms and how they work. I'm sure that's one of the things that Google has to maximize. I'm glad that you're here in Nigeria and that you're here also at Channels Television. And I do know that, developing countries, they do have their own, I don't know whether you've noted any peculiar issues or issues that you think will be peculiar to news organizations, particularly in developing countries.
Well, it's interesting. Not as different as you think. I'll tell you what was different. I was here for this conference, as you mentioned, which was extraordinarily exciting and inspiring. Right? Many journalists, young and old, men and women, working so hard here to serve and protect your young democracy. Right? Interestingly, I come from a country where we're now struggling to accept the fragility of a democracy that we've had for 250 years. Our challenges are the same, right? Our challenges are the same. There are challenges with misinformation. There are challenges with making sure that the press evolves for our new digital age such that it can be relevant and useful and valued by the citizens of that country, such that journalists can do their job to give citizens the information they need to be good citizens. So I wouldn't say there are marked differences. Here, there are challenges with misinformation, just as in the United States.
Indeed, I think that the fragility, which democracy is now facing, is whether it's a young democracy or an even established democracy, is becoming even more apparent. But let's talk a little more about algorithms and how they affect small companies. Just talking about that. How do you think big tech companies like yours can help?
Well, first, and again, I can only speak to Google Search, right? We look at our job as to organize the world's information and make it accessible. We look at our job to make sure that when a user asks us a question about what's going on in Niger or what's going on here in the capital, that we do our best to understand all the sources of information and give them a diverse set of sources and perspectives about the news of the day That doesn't mean just large news outlets. That means small news outlets. That means new news outlets and old. And here, too, what was exciting for me being here is that you have innovation going on across the board, right? The world has changed with the internet. People consume information in many different ways. So it's important that the practice and presentation of journalism occur as well. But it was really inspiring to see the emerging voices doing such good work trying to help address those problems.
So I wonder how you view the quantum of power that you have, because I like to imagine that you are aware of the kind of power you wield, not just at Google, but at Google News as well. And so do you see it as people really know what they want, or you help people, or you give people what you think is best for them? How do you view that?
No, it's a very important question. I tend to think of us as having more responsibility than I would say power. Right? How do we act responsibility? And to your very question, I think it's very critical for us to recognize that our job isn't to tell people what to know, is to give people the information such that they can make their own decisions about any particular issue, right? Sometimes my favorite definition of journalism is giving citizens the information they need to be informed citizens. I think it's our role to point citizens to the information they need provided by a diverse set of news organizations such that they can be informed citizens.
Well, I'm sure you're aware of that theory that there's a programming going on right now. So you essentially give people what you think they need. So there's a programming of the mindset to whatever end anyway. I'm sure you're aware of that. So really, the information you give, as you've said, if I search for a random thing, I probably will get the most visited site. It will probably be the top on that list, or the site a lot of people go to for that kind of information. Not necessarily what might be peculiar to me, because you probably don't have enough analytics or data on me to know that, okay, this particular person wants this that is not in the public domain. So really, to that extent, would you still say you give people what they want from their point of view, or what you think they want?
No, actually, that's not the way we look at it, right? We don't look at surfacing just what is the most popular site. That wouldn't be correct, right? What we want to do is find, again, the most relevant authoritative sites. Some of them may be popular, some of them may be not, but we think that's the best thing to do, not simply feed off of popularity. And by the way, we may know what things are interested in, but one thing we're very careful not to do is we make no effort to understand the political view of our users, for instance, right? That's their private information. So we don't think, oh, you're a person from this point on the political spectrum, we're going to make sure you get just that. That's not our role, and we don't think it's appropriate to our role.
So let's bring it back now to the work we do as journalists. Journalism essentially, we see it as simply reporting the news. But now things are changing so much. So with all of the AI tools, all of the tech coming in, do you think it makes it more complex, like adding more layers to it beyond the simple job or role of reporting what is going on, essentially ask the questions, interrogate the issues? Do you see it as making it more complex?
I look at the advent of artificial intelligence and the ability to help craft words. Clearly, the world is getting new capabilities. I think for journalists, there's a tremendous opportunity here to help them do their job more efficiently, right? We have tools, for instance, that help investigative journalists using AI access thousands and thousands of documents. I'll give you an example. Let's say a news outfit here got 10,000 documents from the government about restaurant violations, right? And they wanted to analyze them. We have tools that would help them analyze them, say how many reports, what region, what kind of reports. Help the reporter find the story, help the reporter write the story. So we think there are a lot of capabilities in AI to, in a sense, give journalists the superpowers they need to be more effective in this digital world, for them to be more effective. Reporting journalism is hard and is expensive. So to the extent we can make their jobs easier, to the extent that we can allow them and their teams to do more, I think that's a powerful thing.
Well, my colleagues in Lagos, so this is happening both in Abuja and Lagos, will have questions for you, which you'll be hearing shortly. But just before we go to Lagos, I also want to ask about the challenges that you are facing, because increasingly governments are very interested in the work that big techs are doing, because this is having an effect on how, the populace consumes information and, perhaps the behavior of people thereafter. And increasingly, they want to be able to see what comes into their space, what information is being fed.
Right.
So how is that affecting the work that you do at Google? Are you increasingly having to engage with individual governments, or what precisely is happening?
Well, indeed, the governments of the world have become much more alert to the impact of the internet on their societies. And they are looking in many ways at regulation. Might it be to address misinformation or privacy, so on and so forth, many issues. And I do spend a lot of time doing that today. And it's certainly understandable and appropriate for governments to do this. It's not for us to dictate what those governments to do. I do often ask the questions, because in many of these contexts, the regulation may affect the operations of the press. And so the question I often ask in working with people around the world is, it's up to you to determine, in a sense, what flavor of press freedom do you want in your society, right? I think journalists understand that what they want from the government is an explicit regard for the freedom of the press. And what they're often cautioned of is regulation that might seek to control the press or manage it in one fashion or another. And so we look at that in collaboration with publishers to do our best to make sure that regulation that does evolve is thoughtful with regard to the freedom of the press, with regard to free expression, with regard to, again, making sure citizens have access to the information they need to be effective citizens.
Okay, let's take this to Lagos now. Bukola and Ayo.
Yes, thank you, Mokwe. It's good to see you, Mr. Gingram. It feels pretty much like Google has come closer home. I'd like to take you up on AI as well, as a follow-up to my colleague's question there in Abuja. Besides aiding the work of journalists, really, it's also challenging the skills set of journalists, the expertise of journalists. And in fact, in the academia also, it's challenging the ability of our young people to, pretty much exercise their mental faculties into complacency. I'm wondering what counsel you're offering here, such that AI can be used for the purpose for which it was established, and not cause us to become dependent.
Well, there are several important questions there. First, it's the responsibility of those who are developing these AI tools. And of course, there are many that we know, some that we don't around the world, right? This is happening. And when I look at our work at Google, it's to be responsible at how we evolve those tools from the core language models that they are, to append them with sources of data and knowledge to make them more effective. Clearly, adding these new tools, say, into schools, into colleges, it can be, I think, hugely helpful and additive. And hopefully not something, as you might say, that students rely on simply because it's the easiest way to accomplish the task. I do think people in academia will come to understand where it's being used and where it's not. I mean, you could look at back, this is not the first time technology has had that kind of impact in education, right? Some of us remember the slide rule. Many of us remember the calculator. Others simply remember Google, where you can simply go to Google and ask a question and get an answer. So we've seen a progression of these things, many of which we think are extraordinarily useful for us to develop knowledge and intelligence and skills. And so, yes, will we see new challenges here as we have in the past? Of course. But I think if we're smart, both from those who are making the tools and those who are using the tools, and teachers who are guiding their students on the tools, will similarly develop the techniques to make sure these tools are being used as effectively as possible and are not doing anything to, in a sense, deteriorate the educational opportunity.
So, Gingra, let's talk about consumer behavior for a tiny bit. I did some checks some years ago about news consumption. And I found out that news is the number one most consumed content in the world. Not music, not movies, not entertainment, news. And I also found out in that study that the population, the demography that consumes online content the most are young people. I also found out that young people don't like news. So that's some kind of conundrum, wouldn't you say? So how do we, in the face of this changing face of journalism, with the threats and opportunities that it presents, from what Malkwe asked you, earlier, how do we balance these challenges? Packaging news for young people, in the way it'll be functional for them, because as you said the other time, it's for them to make up their mind. How do you package such content for them in a way that it is functional for their use in their nations, wherever it is that they are?
And you ask an extraordinarily important question. I would note, of course, that over the course of history, youth have often not been the large consumers of news, right? When you're 13, 14, 15, you don't have a whole lot of interest in what's going on in serious news. You only start to gain that when you move into adulthood, when you have a family. So that's fairly common. But I do not want to dismiss your point that younger generations aren't consuming news to the extent we'd like, and maybe the problem has gotten worse. And I think there's both challenge and opportunity there. I think the challenge is how do we address their perception of the relevance and value of news to them is one question. I think that's hugely important for the world of journalism. I think the second is, are we thinking about how to present news in forms that are more appropriate to their generation, right? We're in a generation of TikTok and WhatsApp and other approaches, YouTube, where people are consuming information in smaller bits and bytes. So might it be thoughtful and useful on the part of the journalism community to begin thinking, how do we take and present news in other forms that are more appropriate to these emerging generations? I think from Google's perspective here too, we need to both make sure that these new forms are available to users when they look for them. I think we also increasingly want to look and see, well, how do we provide not just what's the latest information on a story, but can we provide, say, the basic from third-party sources, from journalists, say, a primer, a quick introduction to the story, the background on the story, to help them understand the true nature of what it is. So, however this might be an age-old problem, it is a challenge, and it's extraordinarily important in our societies. Young people today aren't growing up into their 20s and reading newspapers anymore. They're reading online. They're reading from their devices. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that and address that and see it as an opportunity.
Well, perhaps on the same issue, Ms. Jingra, just one quick one from me. Is there a role for Google in this particular question? Because earlier in response, I think, to Malkwe or Kari's question with you right there, you talked about misinformation being a global problem. So, and then misinformation is shared online, and hey, someone gets on Google, types a thing or two, and some of those information actually comes through that search. So is there a way that Google, is there a role for Google, or a way that Google can, or maybe whether or not it's a policy you may want to let us know, delist, if I can use that term, publications or websites that actually do publish fake news or misinformation, sometimes in some cases disinformation? Is there a way that Google does that? Is there a policy around that?
Yes, there's an important role to play there. And it can happen in several different ways and does happen. One is, are we working with the journalism community to provide them with training on new technologies and tools to be effective in this modern digital world? Also being effective themselves in understanding and detecting sources of information. And then we, too, are doing our work all the time to understand sources of disinformation as they come about. Can we detect these coordinated efforts by dark players seeking to spread harmful information? That's our job to do, and we do that in working with the community of news organizations. We do that with governments. It's important for us that we also hear from people. What are you seeing? What problems are you seeing? How can you address them? We also, over the last decade, have done a lot to further develop the whole arena of fact-checking, where there are organizations who are checking misinformation and making content available that says, actually, here is the correct answer to this question, such that we can also surface those in the search results on queries where we think misinformation might be appearing. There's no question we have a responsibility and a role there, and that's an ongoing one. It's an ongoing challenge because we'll always see new attempts, new efforts by people who seek to take advantage of others with misinformation and disinformation, and it's our job to make sure that we reduce that as much as possible.
Well, sustainability is a major challenge, is a major issue, and a lot of people look at, the fact that business models are changing, and in some instances they look at you as the enemy. You're taking almost all of the advertising. Well, of course you can respond to that, but is it something that Google is also worried about, the fact that newsrooms across the world are struggling as a result of, changing models of business, and how do you think that Google and newsrooms can collaborate more on issues of sustainability?
These are important issues, and they concern us deeply, and we are doing those collaborations. I think it's very important to recognize, first of all, as we look at the world, we think this is important because we know journalism is important. We think this is important also because our business is healthiest in open societies. And open societies are retained and maintained as open societies because of your work in the journalism community. So we do have a sense of direct responsibility to work with the journalism community to make sure there are sustainable, independent sources of quality information. Yes, the business models have changed. The internet has disrupted everything. The advertising didn't move to Google. If you look at it, newspapers used to make a lot of money off of classified advertising. It moved to the internet. Large department stores with e-commerce moved to the internet. And so a lot of these advertising categories that were big in the world of print barely exist in the world of digital. There are also positives, by the way, to internet advertising. 2/3 of our advertisers are small businesses who couldn't afford to advertise in the world of print because it wasn't efficient. I own a small restaurant in a small community. With Google search, if I'm looking for a restaurant in that community, that's actually a very effective place for them to put an advertisement. So, the disruption, the internet did indeed cause that disruption. It's changing the business models. But here, too, we're looking to work, as I was here this week. How do we drive innovation, not only in how journalism is produced and presented, but with the business models as well, right? How do we, again, stimulate the relevance and value of news to users such that they're more inclined to pay for it? Are there different approaches to advertising, different approaches to the business model? In fact, we will have a workshop in Lagos in October on sustainable business models for publishers here to come together for trainings and explorations of how to make that work. So there too, we are part of this ecosystem in partnership with publishers, in partnership with local societies, and it's of critical importance that we play our part, and we will do our best to play our part, and our ears are always open as to how we can do that better.
Is that AI tool ready for news articles? Forgive me.
The AI tools right now are in very early test. You can access them. There's Bard at google.com, bard.google.com, or google.com/Bard. You can see some of these tools in their early stages. We're at the very early stages of development. to make them more thoughtful, more smarter, and then to refine them into tools that journalists can use, where, for instance, the language model can then be paired with an understanding of your editorial policies, your content, such that they might help you draft articles, draft scripts that are appropriate to you here at Channels. But this will happen over the coming months and years.
Well, Mr. Richard Gingras, Vice President, Google News, thank you so much for coming on our program this morning, Sunrise Daily. It's very heartwarming to know that you'll be back again in October, and we hope that in that time, or before you leave, that you'll have a little more time to explore the beauty that our country offers.
Absolutely, it's been a delight. I look forward to coming back. I was introduced finally to jollof rice, so that's an accomplishment done.
Fantastic. Okay.
So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Oh, well, we'll be taking your mails and tweets now, but I'm going to be sending you over to Lagos for that.
Well, thank you, Markwe. This first one is an email from Leo Puarade talking about the insecurity in Zamfara State. It's unfortunate and highly disheartening that bandits will advance to that level of trying to take over Gusau, the state capital, when we have functional police and military in place. Anyway, we have confidence in the new service chiefs and the new acting IG to curtail the menace of those bandits.
Well, Henry Okeke has this to say. The decision of the Enugu state government to ban the illegal sit-at-home is highly commendable and should be supported fully by the federal government and the good people of Enugu state. However, more efforts are required in the area of safeguarding and incentivizing, I believe that is, traders, workers, and students to join hands with the state government in ending the needless sit-at-home.
Well, but for me, the most important thing for me about this sit-at-home is let's just make sure that it is permanent, this whole resolution.
Amen.
Abuja.
Well, we see many more feedback here. I think we're only able to take two. I see from Aburo Kenneth, from Olayinka Oshibodu, and Dixon Eka. Well, I see that they put them online, but I am afraid that we're totally out of time. We just have to say thank you so much for sending in that feedback and for being a part of our conversation this morning. I'm Maokwe Ogun-Yusuf.
I'm Kayode Okikelu.
And I'm Nell Taigwe. Don't worry, we're sending him back.
Yes, from Lagos, I am Bukola Koka.
Do have a wonderful and productive day. I'm Ayo Makinde.